In this video, I'd like to show you how to get started using the Excel library within the NetAdvantage WPF Data Visualization Suite. Now, one thing to know about what I'm doing here is I'm using one of our line of business controls, the xamDataGrid, in order to present the data. But the Excel library that I'm using to extract the data out of the grid and write it out to a document on my machine is from a DLL that's found in the data visualization package. So I just want to make you aware of that. So the first part of what we'll do is import the data from Excel. So I'll click on this button and I'll find my data file. So the data is being fed directly from the first worksheet within the Excel workbook and into the xamDataGrid here. And so that's importing data from the grid. Now to export the data out, all I have to do is simply click on this button, choose a file name. I've been testing this, so I'll overwrite it. And if we take a look at this Excel sheet, you can see that the data is exactly what we have in the grid. So we'll go now into Visual Studio and I'll show you how it's done. The view for the sample is very simple. I simply have a grid, the layout grid on the page, and then within that I have my xamDataGrid and then some buttons down at the bottom. You can see that I have a field set up for each one of the columns within the Excel sheet, and that's basically it. There's nothing else fancy going on. I've got the buttons here, which will delegate off to some event handlers in the code behind, and that's where really all the work is done. So let's view now the code behind and see how we're getting started. So we've got two things happening here. We've got the Excel import click and the Excel export click. So we'll start with the import here. So the first thing that we need to do is open up an open file dialog, and we're filtering it to look simply for Excel files. And so once we have that dialog, then we can just use the file name to do a file info, and if we have an instance of that file and we're double checking to make sure we have the right extension, this is kind of just all checking code at this point, then we can create a new workbook, and you'll see that this is in the namespace infragistics.excel. Once we have a workbook, then we can take the file and open it as a stream and then load that stream into the workbook, and now we have a fully loaded instance of that workbook. Then just making sure that that workbook is still hydrated for us to work with, we'll make sure that we can access the worksheets, and we'll go to the first worksheet within the workbook. And then it's a simple process of just looping through the rows and taking the values out of the rows and putting it into an observable collection for the grid. Now there's a little nuance here that's different than what you might see if you just tried to code this up yourself. Instead of having to do a bunch of casting over and over again within these rows, I created some extension methods for the workbook. So you'll see here that we have the rows and the cells, and let's go to the definition on this, and you can see that it's actually a worksheet cell that I did the extension method for. So I did get value string, get value bool, get value integer, and that's all I needed for the sample, but you could do basically the same thing. And what this does is basically does the right type of checking that I need in order to make sure that I get the value out that's necessary. So for the string, I'm just calling toString on the cell value. For the Boolean, I'm doing a try parse to make sure I'm not trying to convert anything that's not a Boolean into a bool value, and doing the same thing here for the integers. And that keeps all the code fairly safe as we're running through it. So that's the worksheet cell extensions. And I just use each one of those methods in order to fill the properties on my model object and create that observable collection, and then set the grid's data source equal to the products. So that's importing. In order to export the data out from the grid, there's a couple things that I needed to do, and I really try hard to keep as little code in the view as possible, so I created some more extension methods for the xamDataGrid in order to do two things. I need to get the field names or the header names and also the data out of the grid. And then I created an extension method for the workbook in order to take the headers and the data and create a worksheet within the workbook. So I'll go through all this very carefully. So first, to get the field names, so I created another extension method, getFieldNames. So here we have the xamDataGrid extensions and getFieldNames. I'm using the current instance of the grid that we're looking at, and the first thing I do is get cells in view. So this gives me the visible data within the grid. And from that block I can access the fields, and then it's simply a case of looping through the fields, and with the xamDataGrid, either the label or the name will have the column name, and so based off of what's defined in it, I'm adding that to the collection. And so once I go through each one of those, the field names will have everything I need. Now when we go back to our code behind, the next thing that I'll do is get the data. And so here's the column headers. Now I need the real data out of the grid. So let's take a look at this definition. And you can see here that it's basically the same approach I did for the headers. So I'm looking for cells in view, and this gives me the visible data within the grid. And then I can go through the fields and the records. And so it's basically a nested loop here. So as I cycle through each one of the records or the rows within the grid, then I can go through each field, or basically the column in the grid, and add each of those to a data item class and add those data items to a list. Now, data item, if you take a look at this really quick, is just a container for a generic object list. Now, I want you to be able to see the forest through the trees of all this. This is completely side to working with the Excel library. But whatever control you're working with, you need to have a way of getting the real data to work with. And so this is the approach that I chose to use in order to make it work with the xamDataGrid. So finally here we come down to working with the workbook. And I just created some factory methods here in order to create the workbook for us. And so this is some really simple code. I'm just creating a new instance of the workbook and then adding a worksheet based off of the sheet name that's passed into the method. And then I have the default column width here, and also whether or not I want to freeze the top row. So if I'm freezing the top row, then I have the display options panes are frozen, and then display options frozen pane setting, frozen rows, and we're looking at the first row, and then the default column width being whatever I pass in. So you may choose to do something like this. Maybe you have some Excel sheets that you need set up with some common settings. Perhaps this is one way you might want to approach that problem. So based off of the factory, I now have an instance of the workbook. I know it has the worksheet filled in with it, so now I can fill that worksheet with the field names and the data. So in comes another extension method. So let's take a look at this one. And it's pretty basic here. All I'm doing is looping through the headers that come in and also the data. And so what's nice about how this works is that the worksheet already exists, and so the rows and the columns are already there. If you're used to using maybe data tables or some other sort of data structure, often what you'll have to do is create everything before you begin to use it. Well, it's created for you. So you can see that I can go to the worksheet, start with the row 0, and go into the cells, and as I loop through all my column names, I can use the cell index to say add in that header. So this will go to the first row and just put the headers in each one of the cells for me. Now, since we did that, when we start doing the data, we need to make sure that the row index that we're starting with is 1, because we've already used row index 0 here. And so that's why row index is pre-populated with 1. So as we loop through the data items represent a row within the grid, and then its contents are the cell values. And so as we loop through each item, then we can take a look at its contents and go to the worksheet, the rows based off of the row index, look at the cell based off of the cell index that we're tracking up here, and then set the value equal to whatever the value comes through within this loop. So that's the fill method that will fill up the worksheet for us. Now we're just about done. The next thing that we have to do is open up a save file dialog, and we'll filter it for Excel, and then we'll show the dialog, and the last step is to open the file and export the stream out, giving the user a chance to save it and then closing the stream.
Infragistics. On the web at infragistics.com.